Agnes Gray by Anne Bronte. Chapter 7. Horton Lodge. The 31st of January was a wild, tempestuous day. There was a strong north wind, with a continual storm of snow drifting on the ground and whirling through the air. My friends would have had me delay my departure, but fearful of prejudicing my employers against me by such want of punctuality at the commencement of my undertaking, I persisted in keeping the appointment. I will not inflict upon my readers an account of my leaving home on that dark winter morning, the fond farewells, the long, long journey to O, the solitary waitings in inns for coaches or trains, for there were some railways then, and finally the meeting at O with Mr. Murray's servant, who had been sent with the phaeton to drive me from thence to Horton Lodge. I will just state that the heavy snow had thrown such impediments in the way of both horses and steam engines that it was dark some hours before I reached my journey's end, and that a most bewildering storm came on at last, which made the few miles space between O and Horton Lodge a long and formidable passage. I sat resigned with the cold, sharp snow drifting through my veil and filling my lap, seeing nothing, and wondering how the unfortunate horse and driver could make their way even as well as they did. And indeed it was but a toilsome, creeping style of progression, to say the best of it. At length we paused, and at the call of the driver someone unlatched and rolled back upon their creaking hinges what appeared to be the park gates. Then we proceeded along a smoother road, whence occasionally I perceived some huge, hoary mass gleaming through the darkness, which I took to be a portion of a snow-clad tree. After a considerable time we paused again before the stately portico of a large house with long windows descending to the ground. I rose with some difficulty from under the superincumbent snowdrift, and alighted from the carriage, expecting that a kind and hospitable reception would indemnify me for the toils and hardships of the day. A gentleman person in black opened the door, and admitted me into a spacious hall, lighted by an amber-colored lamp suspended from the ceiling. He led me through this along a passage, and opening the door of a back room, told me that was the schoolroom. I entered and found 2 young ladies and 2 young gentlemen, my future pupils, I supposed. After a formal greeting, the elder girl, who was trifling over a piece of canvas and a basket of German wools, asked if I should like to go upstairs. I replied in the affirmative, of course. "Matilda, take a candle and show her her room," she said. Miss Matilda, a strapping hoyden of about 14, with a short frock and trousers, shrugged her shoulders and made a slight grimace, but took a candle and proceeded before me up the back stairs, a long, steep double flight, and through a long, narrow passage to a small but tolerably comfortable room. She then asked me if I would take some tea or coffee. I was about to answer no, but remembering that I had taken nothing since 7 o'clock that morning, and feeling faint in consequence, I said I would take a cup of tea. Saying she would tell Brown, the young lady departed, and by the time I had divested myself of my heavy, wet cloak, shawl, bonnet, etc., a mincing damsel came to say the young ladies desired to know whether I would take my tea up there or in the schoolroom. Under the plea of fatigue, I chose to take it there. She withdrew, and after a while returned again with a small tea-tray, and placed it on the chest of drawers, which served as a dressing-table. Having civilly thanked her, I asked at what time I should be expected to rise in the morning. "The young ladies and gentlemen breakfast at 8:30, ma'am," said she. "They rise early, but as they seldom do any lessons before breakfast, I should think it will do if you rise soon after 7. I desired her to be so kind as to call me at 7, and promising to do so, she withdrew. Then, having broken my long fast on a cup of tea and a little thin bread and butter, I sat down beside the small smouldering fire, and amused myself with a hearty fit of crying, after which I said my prayers, and then, feeling considerably relieved, began to prepare for bed. Finding that none of my luggage was brought up, I instituted a search for the bell, and failing to discover any signs of such a convenience in any corner of the room, I took my candle and ventured through the long passage and down the steep stairs on a voyage of discovery. Meeting a well-dressed female on the way, I told her what I wanted, but not without considerable hesitation, as I was not quite sure whether it was one of the upper servants or Mrs. Murray herself. It happened, however, to be the lady's maid. With the air of one conferring an unusual favor, she vouchsafed to undertake the sending up of my things, and when I had re-entered my room and waited and wondered a long time, greatly fearing that she had forgotten or neglected to perform her promise, and doubting whether to keep waiting or go to bed or go down again, my hopes at length were revived by the sound of voices and laughter, accompanied by the tramp of feet along the passage, and presently the luggage was brought in by a rough-looking maid and a man, neither of them very respectful in their demeanor to me. Having shut the door upon their retiring footsteps and unpacked a few of my things, I betook myself to rest, gladly enough, for I was weary in body and mind. It was with a strange feeling of desolation, mingled with a strong sense of the novelty of my situation, and a joyless kind of curiosity concerning what was yet unknown, that I awoke the next morning, feeling like one whirled away by enchantment, and suddenly dropped from the clouds into a remote and unknown land, widely and completely isolated from all he had ever seen or known before, or like a thistle seed borne on the wind to some strange nook of uncongenial soil, where it must lie long enough before it can take root and germinate, extracting nourishment from what appears so alien to its nature, if indeed it ever can. But this gives no proper idea of my feelings at all, and no one that has not lived such a retired stationary life as mine can possibly imagine what they were, hardly even if he has known what it is to awake some morning and find himself in Port Nelson in New Zealand, with a world of waters between himself and all that knew him. I shall not soon forget the peculiar feeling with which I raised my blind and looked out upon the unknown world. A wide white wilderness was all that met my gaze, a waste of deserts tossed in snow and heavy-laden groves. I descended to the schoolroom with no remarkable eagerness to join my pupils, though not without some feeling of curiosity respecting what a further acquaintance would reveal. One thing among others of more obvious importance I determined with myself. I must begin with calling them Miss and Master. It seemed to me a chilling and unnatural piece of punctilio between the children of a family and their instructor and daily companion, especially where the former were in their early childhood, as at Wellwood House, but even there my calling the little Bloomfields by their simple names had been regarded as an offensive liberty, as their parents had taken care to show me by carefully designating them Master and Miss Bloomfield, etc., in speaking to me. I had been very slow to take the hint, because the whole affair struck me as so very absurd. But now I determined to be wiser, and begin at once with as much form and ceremony as any member of the family would be likely to require, and indeed the children being so much older, there would be less difficulty, though the little words Miss and Master seemed to have a surprising effect in repressing all familiar, open-hearted kindness, and extinguishing every gleam of cordiality that might arise between us. As I cannot, like Dogberry, find it in my heart to bestow all my tediousness upon the reader, I will not go on to bore him with a minute detail of all the discoveries and proceedings of this and the following day. No doubt he will be amply satisfied with a slight sketch of the different members of the family and a general view of the first year or two of my sojourn among them. To begin with the head, Mr. Murray was by all accounts a blustering, roystering country squire, a devoted fox hunter, a skilful horse jockey and farrier, an active practical farmer, and a hardy bon vivant. By all accounts, I say, for except on Sundays, when he went to church, I never saw him from month to month, unless in crossing the hall or walking in the grounds, the figure of a tall, stout gentleman with scarlet cheeks and crimson nose happened to come across me, on which occasions, if he passed near enough to speak, an unceremonious nod, accompanied by a "Morning, Miss Gray," or some such brief salutation, was usually vouchsafed. Frequently, indeed, his loud laugh reached me from afar, and oftener still I heard him swearing and blaspheming against the footman, groom, coachman, or some other hapless dependent. Mrs. Murray was a handsome, dashing lady of 40, who certainly required neither rouge nor padding to add to her charms, and whose chief enjoyments were, or seemed to be, in giving or frequenting parties, and in dressing at the very top of the fashion. I did not see her till 11 o'clock on the morning after my arrival, when she honored me with a visit, just as my mother might step into the kitchen to see a new servant girl. Yet not so either, for my mother would have seen her immediately after her arrival, and not waited till the next day, and moreover she would have addressed her in a more kind and friendly manner, and given her some words of comfort as well as a plain exposition of her duties. But Mrs. Murray did neither the one nor the other. She just stepped into the schoolroom on her return from ordering dinner in the housekeeper's room, bade me good morning, stood for 2 minutes by the fire, said a few words about the weather and the rather rough journey I must have had yesterday, petted her youngest child, a boy of 10, who had just been wiping his mouth and hands on her gown after indulging in some savory morsel from the housekeeper's store, told me what a sweet good boy he was, and then sailed out, with a self-complacent smile upon her face, thinking, no doubt, that she had done quite enough for the present, and had been delightfully condescending into the bargain. Her children evidently held the same opinion, and I alone thought otherwise. After this she looked in upon me once or twice during the absence of my pupils, to enlighten me concerning my duties towards them. For the girls she seemed anxious only to render them as superficially attractive and showily accomplished as they could possibly be made without present trouble or discomfort to themselves, and I was to act accordingly, to study and strive to amuse and oblige, instruct, refine, and polish with the least possible exertion on their part, and no exercise of authority on mine. With regard to the 2 boys, it was much the same, only instead of accomplishments, I was to get the greatest possible quantity of Latin grammar and Valpes Delectus into their heads, in order to fit them for school, the greatest possible quantity, at least without trouble to themselves. John might be a little high-spirited, and Charles might be a little nervous and tedious. "But at all events, Miss Gray," said she, "I hope you will keep your temper, and be mild and patient throughout, especially with the dear little Charles. He is so extremely nervous and susceptible, and so utterly unaccustomed to anything but the tenderest treatment. You will excuse my naming these things to you, for the fact is, I have hitherto found all the governesses, even the very best of them, faulty in this particular. They wanted that meek and quiet spirit, which St. Matthew, or some of them, says is better than the putting on of apparel. You will know the passage to which I allude, for you are a clergyman's daughter. But I have no doubt you will give satisfaction in this respect as well as the rest. And remember, on all occasions, when any of the young people do anything improper, if persuasion and gentle remonstrance will not do, let one of the others come and tell me, for I can speak to them more plainly than it would be proper for you to do, and make them as happy as you can, Miss Gray, and I dare say you will do very well." I observed that while Mrs. Murray was so extremely solicitous for the comfort and happiness of her children, and continually talking about it, she never once mentioned mine, though they were at home surrounded by friends, and I an alien among strangers, and I did not yet know enough of the world not to be considerably surprised at this anomaly. Miss Murray, otherwise Rosalie, was about 16 when I came, and decidedly a very pretty girl. And in 2 years longer, as time more completely developed her form and added grace to her carriage and deportment, she became positively beautiful, and that in no common degree. She was tall and slender, yet not thin, perfectly formed, exquisitely fair, though not without a brilliant, healthy bloom. Her hair, which she wore in a profusion of long ringlets, was of a very light brown, inclining to yellow. Her eyes were pale blue, but so clear and bright that few would wish them darker. The rest of her features were small, not quite regular, and not remarkably otherwise, but altogether you could not hesitate to pronounce her a very lovely girl. I wish I could say as much for mind and disposition as I can for her form and face. Yet think not I have any dreadful disclosures to make. She was lively, light-hearted, and could be very agreeable with those who did not cross her will. Towards me, when I first came, she was cold and haughty, then insolent and overbearing. But on a further acquaintance she gradually laid aside her airs, and in time became as deeply attached to me as it was possible for her to be to one of my character and position, for she seldom lost sight, for above half an hour at a time, of the fact of my being a hireling and a poor curate's daughter. And yet, upon the whole, I believe she respected me more than she herself was aware of, because I was the only person in the house who steadily professed good principles, habitually spoke the truth, and generally endeavored to make inclination bow to duty. And this I say, not of course in condemnation of myself, but to show the unfortunate state of the family to which my services were, for the present, devoted. There was no member of it in whom I regretted this sad want of principle so much as Miss Murray herself, not only because she had taken a fancy to me, but because there was so much of what was pleasant and prepossessing in herself that in spite of her failings I really liked her, when she did not rouse my indignation or ruffle my temper by too great a display of her faults. These, however, I would fain persuade myself were rather the effect of her education than her disposition. She had never been perfectly taught the distinction between right and wrong. She had, like her brothers and sisters, been suffered from infancy to tyrannize over nurses, governesses, and servants. She had not been taught to moderate her desires, to control her temper, or bridle her will, or to sacrifice her own pleasure for the good of others. Her temper being naturally good, she was never violent or morose, but from constant indulgence and habitual scorn of reason, she was often testy and capricious. Her mind had never been cultivated. Her intellect at best was somewhat shallow. She possessed considerable vivacity, some quickness of perception, and some talent for music and the acquisition of languages, but till 15 she had troubled herself to acquire nothing. Then the love of display had roused her faculties, and induced her to apply herself, but only to the more showy accomplishments. And when I came it was the same. Everything was neglected but French, German, music, singing, dancing, fancy work, and a little drawing, such drawing as might produce the greatest show with the smallest labor, and the principal parts of which were generally done by me. For music and singing, besides my occasional instructions, she had the attendance of the best master the country afforded, and in these accomplishments, as well as in dancing, she certainly attained great proficiency. To music, indeed, she devoted too much of her time. As governess though I was, I frequently told her, but her mother thought that if she liked it, she could not give too much time to the acquisition of so attractive an art. Of fancy work I knew nothing but what I gathered from my pupil and my own observation, but no sooner was I initiated than she made me useful in 20 different ways. All the tedious parts of her work were shifted onto my shoulders, such as stretching the frames, stitching in the canvas, sorting the wools and silks, putting in the grounds, counting the stitches, rectifying mistakes, and finishing the pieces she was tired of. At 16, Miss Murray was something of a romp, yet not more than is natural and allowable for a girl of that age, but at 17, that propensity, like all other things, began to give way to the ruling passion, and soon was swallowed up in the all-absorbing ambition to attract and dazzle the other sex. But enough of her. Now let us turn to her sister. Miss Matilda Murray was a veritable hoyden, of whom little need be said. She was about 2 years and a half younger than her sister. Her features were larger, her complexion much darker. She might possibly make a handsome woman, but she was far too big-boned and awkward ever to be called a pretty girl, and at present she cared little about it. Rosalie knew all her charms, and thought them even greater than they were, and valued them more highly than she ought to have done, had they been 3 times as great. Matilda thought she was well enough, but cared little about the matter. Still less did she care about the cultivation of her mind and the acquisition of ornamental accomplishments. The manner in which she learned her lessons and practised her music was calculated to drive any governess to despair. Short and easy as her tasks were, if done at all, they were slurred over at any time and in any way, but generally at the least convenient times, and in the way least beneficial to herself and least satisfactory to me. The short half-hour of practising was horribly strummed through, she meantime unsparingly abusing me, either for interrupting her with corrections, or for not rectifying her mistakes before they were made, or something equally unreasonable. Once or twice I ventured to remonstrate with her seriously for such irrational conduct, but on each of those occasions I received such reprehensive expostulations from her mother as convinced me that, if I wished to keep the situation, I must even let Miss Matilda go on in her own way. When her lessons were over, however, her ill humour was generally over too. While riding her spirited pony, or romping with the dogs, or her brothers and sister, but especially with her dear brother John, she was as happy as a lark. As an animal, Matilda was all right, full of life, vigor, and activity. As an intelligent being, she was barbarously ignorant, indocile, careless, and irrational, and consequently very distressing to one who had the task of cultivating her understanding, reforming her manners, and aiding her to acquire those ornamental attainments which, unlike her sister, she despised as much as the rest. Her mother was partly aware of her deficiencies, and gave me many a lecture as to how I should try to form her tastes, and endeavor to rouse and cherish her dormant vanity, and by insinuating skilful flattery to win her attention to the desired objects, which I would not do, and how I should prepare and smooth the path of learning till she could glide along it without the least exertion to herself, which I could not, for nothing can be taught to any purpose without some little exertion on the part of the learner. As a moral agent, Matilda was reckless, headstrong, violent, and unamendable to reason. One proof of the deplorable state of her mind was, that from her father's example she had learned to swear like a trooper. Her mother was greatly shocked at the unladylike trick, and wondered how she had picked it up. "But you can soon break her of it, Miss Gray," said she. "It is only a habit, and if you will just gently remind her every time she does it, I am sure she will soon lay it aside." I not only gently reminded her, I tried to impress upon her how wrong it was, and how distressing to the ears of decent people, but all in vain. I was only answered by a careless laugh, and, "Oh, Miss Gray, how shocked you are! I'm so glad!" Or, "Well, I can't help it. Papa shouldn't have taught me. I learned it all from him, and maybe a bit from the coachman." Her brother John, alias Master Murray, was about 11 when I came, a fine, stout, healthy boy, frank and good-natured in the main, and might have been a decent lad had he been properly educated, but now he was as rough as a young bear, boisterous, unruly, unprincipled, untaught, unteachable, at least for a governess under his mother's eye. His masters at school might be able to manage him better, for to school he was sent, greatly to my relief, in the course of a year, in a state, it is true, of scandalous ignorance as to Latin, as well as the more useful, though more neglected things, and this, doubtless, would all be laid to the account of his education having been entrusted to an ignorant female teacher, who had presumed to take in hand what she was wholly incompetent to perform. I was not delivered from his brother till full 12 months after, when he also was dispatched in the same state of disgraceful ignorance as the former. Master Charles was his mother's peculiar darling. He was little more than a year younger than John, but much smaller, paler, and less active and robust, a pettish, cowardly, capricious, selfish little fellow, only active in doing mischief, and only clever in inventing falsehoods, not simply to hide his faults, but in mere malicious wantonness, to bring odium upon others. In fact, Master Charles was a very great nuisance to me. It was a trial of patience to live with him peaceably. To watch over him was worse, and to teach him, or pretend to teach him, was inconceivable. At 10 years old, he could not read correctly the easiest line in the simplest book, and as according to his mother's principle, he was to be told every word before he had time to hesitate or examine its orthography, and never even to be informed, as a stimulant to exertion, that other boys were more forward than he. It is not surprising that he made but little progress during the 2 years I had charge of his education. His minute portions of Latin, grammar, etc., were to be repeated over to him, till he chose to say he knew them, and then he was to be helped to say them. If he had made mistakes in his little easy sums in arithmetic, they were to be shown him at once, and the sum done for him, instead of his being left to exercise his faculties in finding them out himself, so that, of course, he took no pains to avoid mistakes, but frequently set down his figures at random, without any calculation at all. I did not invariably confine myself to these rules. It was against my conscience to do so, but I seldom could venture to deviate from them in the slightest degree without incurring the wrath of my little pupil, and subsequently of his mamma, to whom he would relate my transgressions maliciously exaggerated or adorned with embellishments of his own, and often, in consequence, was I on the point of losing or resigning my situation. But for their sakes at home I smothered my pride and suppressed my indignation, and managed to struggle on till my little tormentor was dispatched to school. His father declaring that home education was no go for him, it was plain his mother spoiled him outrageously, and his governess could make no hand of him at all. A few more observations about Horton Lodge and its ongoings, and I have done with dry description for the present. The house was a very respectable one, superior to Mr. Bloomfield's, both in age, size, and magnificence. The garden was not so tastefully laid out, but instead of the smooth-shaven lawn, the young trees guarded by palings, the grove of upstart poplars, and the plantation of firs, there was a wide park, stocked with deer, and beautified by fine old trees. The surrounding country itself was pleasant, as far as fertile fields, flourishing trees, quiet green lanes, and smiling hedges with wildflowers scattered along their banks could make it, but it was depressingly flat to one born and nurtured among the rugged hills. We were situated nearly 2 miles from the village church, and consequently the family carriage was put in requisition every Sunday morning, and sometimes oftener. Mr. and Mrs. Murray generally thought it sufficient to show themselves at church once in the course of the day, but frequently the children preferred going a second time to wandering about the grounds all the day with nothing to do. If some of my pupils chose to walk and take me with them, it was well for me, for otherwise my position in the carriage was to be crushed into the corner farthest from the open window, and with my back to the horses, a position which invariably made me sick, and if I were not actually obliged to leave the church in the middle of the service, my devotions were disturbed with a feeling of languor and sickliness, and the tormenting fear of its becoming worse. And a depressing headache was generally my companion throughout the day, which would otherwise have been one of welcome rest and wholly calm enjoyment. "It's very odd, Miss Gray, that the carriage should always make you sick. It never makes me," remarked Miss Matilda. "Nor me either," said her sister, "but I dare say it would, if I sat where she does. Such a nasty, horrid place, Miss Gray. I wonder how you can bear it." "I am obliged to bear it, since no choice is left me," I might have answered, but in tenderness for their feelings I only replied, "Oh, it is but a short way, and if I am not sick in church I don't mind it." If I were called upon to give a description of the usual divisions and arrangements of the day, I should find it a very difficult matter. I had all my meals in the schoolroom with my pupils, at such times as suited their fancy. Sometimes they would ring for dinner before it was half cooked. Sometimes they would keep it waiting on the table for above an hour, and then be out of humor because the potatoes were cold and the gravy covered with cakes of solid fat. Sometimes they would have tea at 4. Frequently they would storm at the servants because it was not in precisely at 5, and when these orders were obeyed, by way of encouragement to punctuality, they would keep it on the table till 7 or 8. Their hours of study were managed in much the same way. My judgment or convenience was never once consulted. Sometimes Matilda and John would determine to get all the plaguey business over before breakfast, and send the maid to call me up at 5:30 without any scruple or apology. Sometimes I was told to be ready precisely at 6, and having dressed in a hurry, came down to an empty room, and after waiting a long time in suspense, discovered that they had changed their minds, and were still in bed, or perhaps, if it were a fine summer morning, Brown would come to tell me that the young ladies and gentlemen had taken a holiday, and were gone out, and then I was kept waiting for breakfast till I was almost ready to faint, they having fortified themselves with something before they went. Often they would do their lessons in the open air, which I had nothing to say against, except that I frequently caught cold by sitting on the damp grass, or from exposure to the evening dew, or some insidious draught, which seemed to have no injurious effect on them. It was quite right that they should be hardy, yet surely they might have been taught some consideration for others who were less so. But I must not blame them for what was, perhaps, my own fault, for I never made any particular objections to sitting where they pleased, foolishly choosing to risk the consequences rather than trouble them for my convenience. Their indecorous manner of doing their lessons was quite as remarkable as the caprice displayed in their choice of time and place. While receiving my instructions, or repeating what they had learned, they would lounge upon the sofa, lie on the rug, stretch, yawn, talk to each other, or look out of the window, whereas I could not so much as stir the fire or pick up the handkerchief I had dropped without being rebuked for inattention by one of my pupils, or told that mamma would not like me to be so careless. The servants, seeing in what little estimation the governess was held by both parents and children, regulated their behavior by the same standard. I have frequently stood up for them, at the risk of some injury to myself, against the tyranny and injustice of their young masters and mistresses, and I always endeavored to give them as little trouble as possible, but they entirely neglected my comfort, despised my requests, and slighted my directions. All servants, I am convinced, would not have done so, but domestics in general, being ignorant and little accustomed to reason and reflection, are too easily corrupted by the carelessness and bad example of those above them, and these, I think, were not of the best order to begin with. I sometimes felt myself degraded by the life I led, and ashamed of submitting to so many indignities, and sometimes I thought myself a fool for caring so much about them, and feared I must be sadly wanting in Christian humility, or that charity which suffereth long, and is kind, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, beareth all things, endureth all things. But with time and patience, matters began to be slightly ameliorated. Slowly, it is true, and almost imperceptibly, but I got rid of my male pupils. That was no trifling advantage, and the girls, as I intimated before concerning one of them, became a little less insolent, and began to show some symptoms of esteem. Miss Gray was a queer creature. She never flattered, and did not praise them half enough, but whenever she did speak favorably of them, or anything belonging to them, they could be quite sure her approbation was sincere. She was very obliging, quiet, and peaceable in the main, but there were some things that put her out of temper. They did not much care for that, to be sure, but still it was better to keep her in tune, as when she was in a good humor she would talk to them, and be very agreeable and amusing sometimes in her way, which was quite different to mamma's, but still very well for a change. She had her own opinions on every subject, and kept steadily to them, very tiresome opinions they often were, as she was always thinking of what was right and what was wrong, and had a strange reverence for matters connected with religion, and an unaccountable liking to good people. End of chapter. Read by Lorraine Montgomery for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. Agnes Gray by Anne Bronte. Chapter 8. The Coming Out. At 18, Miss Murray was to emerge from the quiet obscurity of the schoolroom into the full blaze of the fashionable world, as much of it, at least, as could be had out of London, for her papa could not be persuaded to leave his rural pleasures and pursuits even for a few weeks' residence in town. She was to make her debut on the 3rd of January at a magnificent ball, which her mamma proposed to give to all the nobility and choice gentry of O, and its neighborhood for 20 miles round. Of course, she looked forward to it with the wildest impatience and the most extravagant anticipations of delight. "Miss Gray," said she one evening, a month before the all-important day, as I was perusing a long and extremely interesting letter of my sister's, which I had just glanced at in the morning to see that it contained no very bad news, and kept till now, unable before to find a quiet moment for reading it. "Miss Gray, do put away that dull, stupid letter and listen to me. I'm sure my talk must be far more amusing than that." She seated herself on the low stool at my feet, and I, suppressing a sigh of vexation, began to fold up the epistle. "You should tell the good people at home not to bore you with such long letters," said she, "and, above all, do bid them write on proper note-paper, and not on those great vulgar sheets. You should see the charming little ladylike notes mamma writes to her friends." "The good people at home," replied I, "know very well that the longer their letters are, the better I like them. I should be very sorry to receive a charming little ladylike note from any of them. And I thought you were too much of a lady yourself, Miss Murray, to talk about the vulgarity of writing on a large sheet of paper." "Well, I only said it to tease you, but now I want to talk about the ball, and to tell you that you positively must put off your holidays till it is over." "Why so? I shall not be present at the ball." "No, but you will see the rooms decked out before it begins, and hear the music, and above all, see me in my splendid new dress. I shall be so charming, you'll be ready to worship me. You really must stay." "I should like to see you very much, but I shall have many opportunities of seeing you equally charming on the occasion of some of the numberless balls and parties that are to be, and I cannot disappoint my friends by postponing my return so long." "Oh, never mind your friends. Tell them we won't let you go." "But, to say the truth, it would be a disappointment to myself. I long to see them as much as they to see me, perhaps more." "Well, but it is such a short time." "Nearly a fortnight, by my computation. And besides, I cannot bear the thoughts of a Christmas spent from home, and moreover, my sister is going to be married." "Is she? When?" "Not till next month, but I want to be there to assist her in making preparations, and to make the best of her company while we have her." "Why didn't you tell me before?" "I've only got the news in this letter, which you stigmatize as dull and stupid and won't let me read." "To whom is she to be married?" "To Mr. Richardson, the vicar of a neighboring parish." "Is he rich?" "No, only comfortable." "Is he handsome?" "No, only decent." "Young?" "No, only middling." "Oh, mercy! What a wretch! What sort of a house is it?" "A quiet little vicarage, with an ivy-clad porch, an old-fashioned garden, and—" "Oh, stop! You'll make me sick. How can she bear it?" "I expect she'll not only be able to bear it, but to be very happy. You did not ask me if Mr. Richardson were a good, wise, or amiable man. I could have answered yes to all these questions, at least so Mary thinks, and I hope she will not find herself mistaken. But miserable creature! How can she think of spending her life there, cooped up with that nasty old man and no hope of change? He is not old. He is only 6 or 7 and 30, and she herself is 28, and as sober as if she were 50. Oh, that's better then. They're well matched. But do they call him the worthy vicar? I don't know, but if they do, I believe he merits the epithet. Mercy! How shocking! And will she wear a white apron and make pies and puddings? I don't know about the white apron, but I dare say she will make pies and puddings now and then, but that will be no great hardship, as she has done it before. And will she go about in a plain shawl and a large straw bonnet, carrying tracts and bone soup to her husband's poor parishioners? I'm not clear about that, but I dare say she will do her best to make them comfortable in body and mind, in accordance with our mother's example. End of chapter. Read by Lorraine Montgomery for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. Agnes Gray by Anne Bronte. Chapter 9. The Ball. "Now, Miss Gray," exclaimed Miss Murray immediately I entered the schoolroom after having taken off my outdoor garments upon returning from my 4 weeks' recreation, "now shut the door and sit down, and I'll tell you all about the ball." "No, damn it, no!" shouted Miss Matilda. "Hold your tongue, can't ye, and let me tell her about my new mare. Such a splendor, Miss Gray, a fine blood mare. Do be quiet, Matilda, and let me tell my news first. No, no, Rosalie, you'll be such a damned long time over it. She shall hear me first. I'll be hanged if she doesn't." "I'm sorry to hear, Miss Matilda, that you've not got rid of that shocking habit yet." "Well, I can't help it, but I'll never say a wicked word again if you'll only listen to me and tell Rosalie to hold her confounded tongue." Rosalie remonstrated, and I thought I should have been torn in pieces between them. But Miss Matilda having the loudest voice, her sister at length gave in, and suffered her to tell her story first, so I was doomed to hear a long account of her splendid mare, its breeding and pedigree, its paces, its action, its spirit, etc., and of her own amazing skill and courage in riding it, concluding with an assertion that she could clear a 5-barred gate like winking, that Papa said she might hunt the next time the hounds met, and Mamma had ordered a bright scarlet hunting habit for her. "Oh, Matilda, what stories you are telling!" exclaimed her sister. "Well," answered she, no whit abashed, "I know I could clear a 5-barred gate if I tried, and Papa will say I may hunt, and Mamma will order the habit when I ask it." "Well, now get along," replied Miss Murray, "and do, dear Matilda, try to be a little more ladylike. Miss Gray, I wish you would tell her not to use such shocking words. She will call her horse a mare. It is so inconceivably shocking. And then she uses such dreadful expressions in describing it. She must have learned it from the grooms. It nearly puts me into fits when she begins." "I heard it from Papa, you ass, and his jolly friends," said the young lady, vigorously cracking a hunting whip, which she habitually carried in her hand. "I'm as good judge of horseflesh as the best of 'em." "Well, now get along, you shocking girl. I really shall take a fit if you go on in such a way. And now, Miss Gray, attend to me. I'm going to tell you about the ball. You must be dying to hear about it, I know. Oh, such a ball! You never saw or heard or read or dreamt of anything like it in all your life. The decorations, the entertainment, the supper, the music were indescribable. And then the guests. There were 2 noblemen, 3 baronets, and 5 titled ladies, and other ladies and gentlemen innumerable. The ladies, of course, were of no consequence to me, except to put me in a good humor with myself by showing how ugly and awkward most of them were, and the best, Mamma told me, the most transcendent beauties among them were nothing to me. me. As for me, Miss Gray, I'm so sorry you didn't see me. I was charming, wasn't I, Matilda?" "Middling." "No, but I really was. At least so Mamma said, and Brown and Williamson. Brown said she was sure no gentleman could set eyes on me without falling in love that minute, and so I may be allowed to be a little vain. I know you think me a shocking, conceited, frivolous girl, but then, you know, I don't attribute it all to my personal attractions. I give some praise to the hairdresser, and some to my exquisitely lovely dress. You must see it tomorrow. White gauze over pink satin, and so sweetly made, and a necklace and bracelet of beautiful large pearls. I have no doubt you looked very charming, but should that delight you so very much? Oh, no, not that alone, but then I was so much admired, and I made so many conquests in that one night, you'd be astonished to hear." "But what good will they do you?" "What good? Think of any woman asking that!" "Well, I should think one conquest would be enough, and too much, unless the subjugation were mutual." "Oh, but you know I never agree with you on those points. Now wait a bit, and I'll tell you my principal admirers, those who made themselves very conspicuous that night and after, for I've been to 2 parties since. Unfortunately, the 2 noblemen, Lord G. and Lord F., were married, or I might have condescended to be particularly gracious to them. As it was, I did not, though Lord F., who hates his wife, was evidently much struck with me. He asked me to dance with him twice. He is a charming dancer, by the by, and so am I. You can't think how well I did. I was astonished at myself. My lord was very complimentary, too, rather too much so, in fact, and I thought proper to be a little haughty and repellent, but I had the pleasure of seeing his nasty, cross wife ready to perish with spite and vexation. Oh, Miss Murray, you don't mean to say that such a thing could really give you pleasure, however cross or— Well, I know it's very wrong, but never mind. I mean to be good sometime, only don't preach now. There's a good creature. I haven't told you half yet. Let me see. Oh, I was going to tell you how many unmistakable admirers I had. Sir Thomas Ashby was one, Sir Hugh Meltham, and Sir Broadley Wilson are old codgers, only fit companions for Papa and Mamma. Sir Thomas is young, rich, and gay, but an ugly beast nevertheless. However, Mamma says I should not mind that after a few months' acquaintance. Then there was Henry Meltham, Sir Hugh's younger son, rather good-looking and a pleasant fellow to flirt with. But being a younger son, that is all he is good for. Then there was young Mr. Green, rich enough, but of no family, and a great stupid fellow, a mere country booby. And then our good rector, Mr. Hatfield, an humble admirer he ought to consider himself, but I fear he has forgotten to number humility among his stock of Christian virtues. Was Mr. Hatfield at the ball? Yes, to be sure. Did you think he was too good to go? I thought he might consider it unclerical. By no means. He did not profane his cloth by dancing, but it was with difficulty he could refrain, poor man. He looked as if he were dying to ask my hand just for one set, and oh, by the by, he's got a new curate. That seedy old fellow, Mr. Bligh, has got his long-wished-for living at last, and is gone. And what is the new one like? Oh, such a beast! Weston, his name is. I can give you his description in 3 words. An insensate, ugly, stupid blockhead. That's 4, but no matter. Enough of him now. Then she returned to the ball, and gave me a further account of her deportment there, and at the several parties she had since attended, and further particulars respecting Sir Thomas Ashby, and Messrs. Meltham, Green, and Hatfield, and the ineffaceable impression she had wrought up on each of them. "Well, which of the 4 do you like best?" said I, suppressing my 3rd or 4th yawn. "I detest them all," replied she, shaking her bright ringlets in vivacious scorn. That means, I suppose, I like them all. But which most? No, I really detest them all. But Harry Meltham is the handsomest and most amusing, and Mr. Hatfield the cleverest, Sir Thomas the wickedest, and Mr. Green the most stupid. But the one I'm to have, I suppose, if I'm doomed to have any of them, is Sir Thomas Ashby. Surely not, if he's so wicked, and if you dislike him. Oh, I don't mind his being wicked. He's all the better for that. And as for disliking him, I shouldn't greatly object to being Lady Ashby of Ashby Park, if I must marry. But if I could be always young, I would be always single. I should like to enjoy myself thoroughly, and coquette with all the world, till I am on the verge of being called an old maid, and then, to escape the infamy of that, after having made 10,000 conquests, to break all their hearts save one by marrying some high-born, rich, indulgent husband, whom, on the other hand, 50 ladies were dying to have. Well, as long as you entertain these views, keep single by all means, and never marry at all, not even to escape the infamy of old maidenhood. End of chapter. Read by Lorraine Montgomery for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. Agnes Gray by Anne Bronte. Chapter 10. The Church. "Well, Miss Gray, what do you think of the new curate?" asked Miss Murray, on our return from church the Sunday after the recommencement of our duties. "I can scarcely tell," was my reply. "I have not even heard him preach." "Well, but you saw him, didn't you?" "Yes, but I cannot pretend to judge of a man's character by a single cursory glance at his face." "But isn't he ugly?" "He did not strike me as being particularly so. I don't dislike that cast of countenance, but the only thing I particularly noticed about him was his style of reading, which appeared to me good, infinitely better, at least, than Mr. Hatfield's. He read the lessons as if he were bent on giving full effect to every passage. It seemed as if the most careless person could not have helped attending, nor the most ignorant have failed to understand, and the prayers he read as if he were not reading at all, but praying earnestly and sincerely from his own heart. Oh, yes, that's all he is good for. He can plod through the service well enough, but he has not a single idea beyond it." "How do you know?" "Oh, I know perfectly well. I am an excellent judge in such matters. Did you see how he went out of church, stumping along, as if there were nobody there but himself, never looking to the right hand or the left, and evidently thinking of nothing but just getting out of the church, and perhaps home to his dinner? His great stupid head could contain no other idea." "I suppose you would have had him cast a glance into the squire's pew," said I, laughing at the vehemence of her hostility. "Indeed, I should have been highly indignant if he had dared to do such a thing," replied she, haughtily tossing her head. Then, after a moment's reflection, she added, "Well, well, I suppose he's good enough for his place, but I'm glad I'm not dependent on him for amusement, that's all. Did you see how Mr. Hatfield hurried out to get a bow from me, and be in time to put us into the carriage?" "Yes," answered I, internally adding, "and I thought it somewhat derogatory to his dignity as a clergyman to come flying from the pulpit in such eager haste to shake hands with the squire and hand his wife and daughters into their carriage, and moreover I owe him a grudge for nearly shutting me out of it, for in fact, though I was standing before his face close beside the carriage steps waiting to get in, he would persist in putting them up and closing the door till one of the family stopped him by calling out that the governess was not in yet. Then, without a word of apology, he departed, wishing them good morning, and leaving the footman to finish the business. Nota bene, Mr. Hatfield never spoke to me, neither did Sid Hugh or Lady Meltham, nor Mr. Harry or Miss Meltham, nor Mr. Green or his sisters, nor any other lady or gentleman who frequented that church, nor, in fact, any one that visited at Horton Lodge. Miss Murray ordered the carriage again in the afternoon for herself and her sister. She said it was too cold for them to enjoy themselves in the garden, and besides, she believed Harry Meltham would be at church. For, said she, smiling slyly at her own fair image in the glass, he has been a most exemplary attendant at church these last few Sundays. You would think he was quite a good Christian. And you may go with us, Miss Gray. I want you to see him. He is so greatly improved since he returned from abroad, you can't think. And besides, then you will have an opportunity of seeing the beautiful Mr. Weston again, and of hearing him preach. I did hear him preach, and was decidedly pleased with the evangelical truth of his doctrine, as well as the earnest simplicity of his manner, and the clearness and force of his style. It was truly refreshing to hear such a sermon after being so long accustomed to the dry, prosy discourses of the former curate, and the still less edifying harangues of the rector. Mr. Hatfield would come sailing up the aisle, or rather sweeping along like a whirlwind, with his rich silk gown flying behind him and rustling against the pew doors, mount the pulpit like a conqueror ascending his triumphal car, then sinking on the velvet cushion in an attitude of studied grace, remain in silent prostration for a certain time, then mutter over a collect, and gabble through the Lord's Prayer, rise, draw off one bright lavender glove to give the congregation the benefit of his sparkling rings, lightly pass his fingers through his well-curled hair, flourish a cambric handkerchief, recite a very short passage, or perhaps a mere phrase of Scripture, as a headpiece to his discourse, and finally deliver a composition which as a composition might be considered good, though far too studied and too artificial to be pleasing to me. The propositions were well laid down, the arguments logically conducted, and yet it was sometimes hard to listen quietly throughout without some slight demonstrations of disapproval or impatience. His favorite subjects were church discipline, rites and ceremonies, apostolical succession, the duty of reverence and obedience to the clergy, the atrocious criminality of dissent, the absolute necessity of observing all the forms of godliness, the reprehensible presumption of individuals who attempted to think for themselves in matters connected with religion, or to be guided by their own interpretations of Scripture, and occasionally to please his wealthy parishioners, the necessity of deferential obedience from the poor to the rich, supporting his maxims and exhortations throughout with quotations from the Fathers, with whom he appeared to be far better acquainted than with the apostles and evangelists, and whose importance he seemed to consider at least equal to theirs. But now and then he gave us a sermon of a different order, what some would call a very good one, but sunless and severe, representing the deity as a terrible taskmaster rather than a benevolent father. Yet, as I listened, I felt inclined to think the man was sincere in all he said. He must have changed his views and become decidedly religious, gloomy and austere, yet still devout. But such illusions were usually dissipated on coming out of church by hearing his voice in jocund colloquy with some of the Melthams or Greens, or perhaps the Murrays themselves, probably laughing at his own sermon and hoping that he had given the rascally people something to think about, perchance exulting in the thought that old Betty Holmes would now lay aside the sinful indulgence of her pipe, which had been her daily solace for upwards of 30 years, that George Higgins would be frightened out of his Sabbath evening walks, and Thomas Jackson would be sorely troubled in his conscience and shaken in his sure and certain hope of a joyful resurrection at the last day. Thus, I could not but conclude that Mr. Hatfield was one of those who bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them upon men's shoulders while they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers, and who make the word of God of none effect by their traditions, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. I was well pleased to observe that the new curate resembled him, as far as I could see, in none of these particulars. "Well, Miss Gray, what do you think of him now?" said Miss Murray, as we took our places in the carriage after service. "No harm still," replied I. "No harm?" repeated she in amazement. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I think no worse of them than I did before." "No worse? I should think not, indeed. Quite the contrary. Is he not greatly improved?" "Oh, yes, very much indeed," replied I, for I had now discovered that it was Harry Meltham she meant, not Mr. Weston. That gentleman had eagerly come forward to speak to the young ladies, a thing he would hardly have ventured to do had their mother been present. He had likewise politely handed them into the carriage. He had not attempted to shut me out, like Mr. Hatfield, neither, of course, had he offered me his assistance. I should not have accepted it if he had, but as long as the door remained open, he had stood smirking and chatting with them, and then lifted his hat and departed to his own abode. But I had scarcely noticed him all the time. My companions, however, had been more observant, and as we rolled along, they discussed between them not only his looks, words, and actions, but every feature of his face, and every article of his apparel. "You shan't have him all to yourself, Rosalie," said Miss Matilda at the close of this discussion. "I like him. I know he'd make a nice jolly companion for me." "Well, you're quite welcome to him, Matilda," replied her sister, in a tone of affected indifference. "And I'm sure," continued the other, "he admires me quite as much as he does you. Doesn't he, Miss Gray?" "I don't know. I'm not acquainted with his sentiments." "Well, but he does, though." "My dear Matilda, nobody will ever admire you till you get rid of your rough, awkward manners." "Oh, stuff! Harry Meltham likes such manners, and so do papa's friends." "Well, you may captivate old men and younger sons, but nobody else, I am sure, ever will take a fancy to you." "I don't care. I'm not always grabbing after money like you and mamma. If my husband is able to keep a few good horses and dogs, I shall be quite satisfied, and all the rest may go to the devil." "Well, if you use such shocking expressions, I'm sure no real gentleman will ever venture to come near you. Really, Miss Gray, you should not let her do so." "I can't possibly prevent it, Miss Murray." "And you're quite mistaken, Matilda, in supposing that Harry Meltham admires you. I assure you he does nothing of the kind." Matilda was beginning an angry reply, but happily our journey was now at an end, and the contention was cut short by the footman opening the carriage door and letting down the steps for our descent. End of chapter. Read by Lorraine Montgomery for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu.